Now that we had a chance to kind of get to know the traditionalists a little bit more, we're now going to go a little bit deeper into the baby boomers, typically born between 1945 and 1960. Now remember what I mentioned earlier, sometimes these date ranges are off a little bit depending upon which demographic study that you review. Sometimes this generation is referred to as the boomers. They also received the title of the me generation. For those wondering where the baby boomer title comes from, I'll give a brief background. It might be a little PG-ish. During the first half of the 1940s, birth rates in the United States were on a decline. Then in 1946, the trend quickly changed, almost exactly 9 months after VJ Day, victory over Japan. A flood of babies came forth, creating a boom of babies. Yes, there was celebration going on. This population increase greatly changed the United States' psychological geography. If you fall into this generation, and as you listen to this overview, you might think it just doesn't seem to fit your values and experiences. Don't get concerned. Just continue on with this module, as this generation was one of such massive size and unique experiences that there is a clear division between the beginners and the enders of this group. This large generation is divided into subsets. As children, this generation was healthier than generations of the past. They were more wanted, cared for. Child rearing was a pleasure, not an economic necessity. These babies were adored by parents who had sacrificed and fought a war for the right to bear them. This generation tends to be optimistic. They were raised to see the planet as theirs to shape, and the purpose of the world was to serve their needs and wants. The majority were raised with wealth, as the United States was under the greatest economic expansion in the country. Due to the population size, health care and education growth took the lead spot in the expansion. They lived in nuclear families. Most typical, a working dad and a stay-at-home mom. Children for the first time in history were in the spotlight. They were the hope for the future that their parents fought to preserve. In 1967, Time magazine gave its coveted Man of the Year award to the whole generation, proclaiming them the people who would clean up our cities, end racial inequality, and find a cure for the common cold. Still have a little work to do on that one. As I mentioned earlier, there is a strong divide between the beginners and enders of this generation. Many boomers feel they don't fit the descriptions that the press has given them, and this is most often true in what I call the enders of this generation. Movements of the 1960s and loving adoration that the beginners felt doesn't show up near as strong with the enders of this generation. The beginners were actively involved or observers of Vietnam and civil rights movements. The enders were less impacted by these events and know of them as vague memories. I'll talk more about both of these subsets shortly. Now, some headlines of the times for the baby boomers show up first with our civil rights movement. This generation emotionally connected to Rosa Parks and her courage, Martin Luther King and his dream. They stood to fight for equal rights for all as legally established racial discrimination was in abundance. Vietnam War. Immediately following the ending of the Korean War, the U.S. found themselves re-engaging in another fight against communism as troops were sent to fight in Vietnam. Yes, the tragedy of wartime certainly shapes opinions and views of those who lived through it. The birth control pill, invented in 1960. This was a major defining difference between the birth rates of our baby boomers and our Gen Xers. Peace Corps is established in 1961. This is a volunteer program run by the United States government. Its purpose is to bring global understanding among nations. JFK's assassination. This assassination had a profound effect on the people of the time. Some say his assassination started the decline of U.S. citizens' disillusionment with their political leaders, as the next two presidents following JFK were in effect forced out of office. Johnson losing his re-election due to how unpopular Vietnam was, and Richard Nixon by Watergate. Moon landing. In 1962, President Kennedy had told NASA it was a race against the Russians, and he wanted a moon landing within a decade. Then, on July 20th, 1969, the most historic telephone call ever made takes place as U.S. President Nixon speaks to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin via radio from the Oval Office. They spoke for 2 minutes, and the call is televised on both ends and watched around the world. Woodstock, Jefferson Airplane, Jimi Hendrix, The Grateful Dead, The Who, Janis Joplin, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. 500,000 people spent 4 days experiencing what would later become a moment in music history. On a side note, did you know the organizers of this event went bankrupt as the crowd was so large attendees just hopped fences and avoided paying ticket fees? The Cuban Missile Crisis was a dangerous confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, as two superpowers came close to nuclear warfare. No matter what Hollywood tells you, the X-Men had nothing to do with it. This generation also felt the horror that spread across the nation in 1969 when Charles Manson, an American cult leader, gathered a group of his most loyal followers and carried out a series of Hollywood brutal massacres. An act that shocked the world and brought an end to the 1960s free love and peace legacy. Watergate scandal. All baby boomers will recall this national scandal that led to the impeachment and resignation of U.S. President Richard Nixon, another impact that influenced the political distrust across the nation. Some of the themes that show up with our baby boomers. A baby born every 17 minutes for 19 years. The largest generation in history. The size of this generation continues to impact the U.S. economy as they move through their life stages. Boomers are the first generation to truly do all they can to fight off aging. They are seeking healthier lifestyles. They are enjoying the benefits of all the nips and tucks that medical advances provides. The boomers are eating it all up and supporting the economic boom around these industries. Boomers certainly won't be sitting in rocking chairs for their retirement. They are more apt to be out skiing or skydiving and taking up hobbies of all types. The boomers are redefining retirement, just as they adapted and redefined their earlier life stages. As we spoke previously, the most challenging economic and cultural divide in America was during the boomers' influential years, as feelings about the Vietnam War divided the country, families, and the generation as a whole. As I mentioned earlier, this generation grouping is divided into subsets due to its enormous size. The beginners of the boomers are known as Save the World Revolutionaries. They also have a little bit of a brand for partaking in the pleasure-seeking drugs. LSD, marijuana, and heroin. Free love and world peace was their brand. The second subset, or what I would call the enders, or yuppies of the 70s and 80s, had somewhat of a different experience than the beginners. They had a bit more to worry about, as the beginning of large-scale layoffs and downsizing was hitting America in stride. They tend to show up as overachievers. This subset showed up with stronger personal stamina and higher work ethics than the beginners. In their adult years, these parents felt the impact of the Columbine shootings, the attack on the World Trade Center, the wars in Desert Storm, Iraq. These periods of unrest, as well as many others, kind of created a circle the wagon emotion to protect, or you could say hover, over what was theirs. Their children, now our millennial generation, became top priority. Boomer parents fought for and stood up for opportunities for their children and children everywhere. Fight for equality is another theme among this generation. While mothers were generally housewives responsible for kids in the home, more and more women of this generation began working outside the home and began the trend of two working parents. Here is where we start to see the beginning of equality on child-rearing responsibilities. Some of the imprints that showed up with the baby boomers came with the drug-related deaths of Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin. We also see some comedy showing up strong in the media. An example of the entertainment of their times might be the Mod Squad, Laugh-In, All in the Family, Happy Days, and the first James Bond movie was produced during their years. TV dinners, hula hoops, and slinkies were all the rage. Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Beach Boys, and Bob Dylan are all examples of the music of the day. As the boomers transitioned into their adult years, you see the transition of moving into the suburbs. Lexus and SUVs, designer sunglasses, all helped support the yuppie brand. Some of the adjectives that might best describe the baby boomer generation would be prosperity, healthy, self-focused, spiritual, optimistic, trendsetters, and driven.